Alright, in this next video we're going to talk about actions at an emergency. Actions at an emergency. So what you want to consider is a lot of times you'll see bystanders. So we have bystanders and they're all standing around. No one really knows what to do. This is pretty common. This is a common action of bystanders. I see this a lot, especially on traffic accidents. You have a bunch of individuals standing around, no one really knowing what to do. You have a lot of other cars still driving around and just bypassing, and everybody's assuming that somebody else is happening. So what's important here is that you can recognize that emergencies exist. So recognizing an emergency is key. So if you can recognize an emergency, you'll kind of know what to do based on the emergency. So this will help you decide to act. And probably one of the most important decisions you can make, even if you do nothing at all, is to call 911. So at least if no one else is caring and you decide not to care yourself, that at least you have EMS on their way. So emergency medical services, they'll be on their way and they'll have the proper equipment to care. But here's the problem. Even though you've called 911, and this is the most important step once you determine an emergency exists, there's still going to be that delay of time that they get there. So yes, there are a lot of different barriers to action, and let's talk about those a little bit. Let's talk about some of the barriers or factors. I think your book refers to it as factors to action. And the main one that comes to my mind is that if you're going to decide not to help, that the situation is dangerous. And that's reasonable, and that's all part of you checking the scene. So as soon as you see something happen, the first thing that should go through your mind are the 3 C's. And we'll talk about this further. And this may not be in your book. I know other first aid classes talk about this. Well, the first one stands for checking, or to check. So it's check, call, care. So check. And so what you're doing is checking the scene. But this would also include, once you determine the scene is safe, is checking the victim. And normally you want to use all your senses when you're checking a victim. You want to use sight, auditory, you want to physically touch them and find out what's going on, especially if they're unconscious. So the first C here in the 3 C's is checking, or to check. Check, call, care. So, but this includes checking the scene and checking the victim. The main reason you check the scene is to make sure you don't become a victim yourself, and this is what I was referring to down here when I talked about a dangerous situation. The next C is call. So once you determine that there is indeed an emergency, you want to call 911, make sure help's on its way, and then you can give care. So we always want to call unless it's a care first situation. We'll talk about that later. You have call first situations, you have care first situations. There are some cases where the person needs immediate care, and by calling you would potentially delay treatment, or you would delay treatment, and it could cause further harm. So there are cases where you would actually care before you call, but we'll talk about those later. So those are the 3 C's: checking the scene, or check, call, care. So checking the scene, checking the victim is the first C, then call 911, and then caring for the victim. So the scene may be dangerous, and there's so many different variables that we could talk about, but let me just give you a few rundown. So let's say that it's a traffic accident and we get up on the scene. Well, the first thing, especially if it's on a major highway, I want to worry about the other cars coming down that highway. So I don't want to immediately get out of my car until I park in a safe location or get behind some barrier. Because if I jump out of my car and it's a car pileup, now I no longer have my own car to protect me. Or they could have knocked down a telephone pole. There could be electrical wires. There's so many different situations. It could be a gas tanker roll over, and it could have noxious fumes or catch on fire. So it could be a dangerous situation where you couldn't get to the person to care, and so that would be a barrier to action. Or maybe other first responders arrive, and since they have a higher level of care, you're no longer needed. So that would also be a barrier to action. You're not going to force yourself to help that person if law enforcement's there and they have a higher level of care, or EMS arrive and they have a higher level of care. You want to let those professionals deal with that situation. So there's several barriers. There's also a barrier to action is that you assume, and this is something that you can change, you assume somebody else is helping. And that also happens with calling 911. A lot of times other people assume that other people have called 911. So if you're one of the first people on the scene, you see a bunch of people standing around, even if you see them talking on their phone, don't just assume they've called 911. Call 911 anyway. So when you're calling, there's several things that you want to keep in mind. And this doesn't go in the exact order that your book goes in, but this is just a lot easier to remember than what your book will tell you. So what I always do, and this goes back to when I was a police officer, record what, when, where, and how. So as long as you can record this in your brain or write it down, whatever you need to do so that you have something to tell the 911 operator. So what you can do is you can tell them what type of emergency it is, or if it was an accident, when it happened, because and this doesn't just have to be with an accident. This could be caring for somebody that's having a stroke. So when is extremely important in time-sensitive first aid. So noting the time. So when it happened, where it is, and that's extremely important. If you're out on an accident, 911 needs to know where to dispatch the EMS to, so knowing where it happened and how it happened. So in as much detail, maybe you didn't witness it, but if you did, you can at least say, hey, this is a multi-car pileup, this is how it happened, it's wet streets, or whatever. So the more information you can record, the better. So I always go by this principle of what, when, where, and how. And as long as I can write down just some general information on that, I'll have something to give the 911 operator. So that's something to keep in your mind. Your book goes into, other ways of remembering this, but I think this is much easier than what you'll find in a book. What, when, where, and how. This is a lot of times law enforcement officers that have to keep records use this method, and as long as they do that, they'll be able to give a good report. Now, after you've called and you've given information, and you're let's say we're to the point where we want to give care, there are precautions that you want to take. Hopefully, going back to our last video, you have some sort of PPE, and if you don't know what that means, that's personal protective equipment. And this can be anything from, let's say, breathing barriers. It can be gloves, anything that's going to protect you. And really what you're concerned with are pathogens. Time you're dealing with somebody, especially somebody you don't know where they've been, we're concerned about pathogens. In an accident, like a car accident, we're concerned about blood-borne pathogens. I've got several stories where a lot of times as a law enforcement officer, you kind of rush in and you've really got to watch out for these blood-borne pathogens. Several different ways that you can have these. Of course, you have to be susceptible to these pathogens. You have to have an entry site. So just because you get blood on you doesn't guarantee you're going to get some sort of disease. But there are several ways that you can be exposed to a blood-borne pathogen. You have direct contact. So this would be where, let's say, the blood directly squirts from the person onto you. Indirect. So let's say there's a car accident and I rip open the door and there's blood on the door and I get that on me. That would be indirect. contact. There are other ways of getting pathogens. Of course, this is not blood-borne, but here's some other ways of getting pathogens, which are vector-borne. This would be like a mosquito bite, tick bite. Those would be all vector-borne. Like if you got Lyme disease from a tick or malaria from a mosquito, that would be vector-borne. And airborne. And airborne is one that is a little bit harder to control. So something like TB, tuberculosis, which is a bacteria that gets in your lungs, that can be airborne. There's an extreme strain of TB now that is resistant to antibiotics, and there was an individual a couple years back that got on an airplane with this sort of TB, and everybody on that plane then had to undergo treatment to make sure that they didn't get the TB. So blood-borne, really what we're worried about here is stuff like HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, hepatitis B being chronic, hepatitis C can be chronic. Hepatitis A, you're not necessarily going to get that from blood-borne. It is a pathogen. Normally hepatitis A, Hep A, you're going to get from like contaminated food products, like that's been exposed to like sewage, stuff like that. So hepatitis A tends to be acute, short-term, but hepatitis B and C can be chronic, and there's no known cure for that once you get it. Now there are treatments that you can have if you're going to work in the. They can give you a vaccine for hepatitis B if you're going to work in, let's say, nursing or the health fields. But once you have it, you've got it. So there's no way to get rid of it. So that's hepatitis B, which affects the liver. So those would all be blood-borne, something that we would be concerned with, being exposed to bodily fluids, not just blood. And then we discussed vector-borne and airborne. Airborne could be something as severe as TB or as simple as, let's say, the flu. So somebody sneezes and you get that virus as well. It doesn't have to be just bacteria. So that's all things that we want to protect ourselves against. And so, in the last video we talked about having a first aid kit in your car, and this would be why it's extremely important, is to protect yourself against these pathogens from entering your body. So I'm going to try to keep these videos short, so I hope this helped you make sense of some of the major information in the chapter. Don't bog yourself down with specifics. Look at the general information, and that will definitely help you out on the quizzes and the tests in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.